Why is it that every time an African leader decides to distance his country from the West, particularly France, the next thing we hear is either an assassination attempt or the media calls him a corrupt leader and a dictator? It happened with President Traore, Colonel Assimi Goita, General Tiani, Thomas Sankara, Patrice Lumumba, and Muammar Gaddafi, just to name a few. Currently, it has happened with the President of Chad, Mahamar Idriss Deby. A few days ago, the Chadian President was the target of an assassination attempt that thankfully failed, all thanks to the Chadian military. But the big question is, who is behind the attack and why now? On Wednesday night, January 8th, 2025, the capital city of Chad, N'Djamena, was the scene of a serious clash between Chad's security forces and more than a dozen armed fighters who brazenly stormed the presidential palace. According to the government spokesman and Foreign Minister Abderaman Koulamallah, a group of 24 heavily armed men attacked the president's office at around 8:45 p.m. on Wednesday. The men were armed with knives, not guns, he said. At least 18 of the attackers were unalive in the ensuing gun battle, while one member of the Chadian security force also died. The incident took place while the Chadian President, Mahamar Idriss Deby Itno, was inside the palace following a meeting between Chadian leaders and the Chinese Foreign Minister, Wang Yi, who was in the country for a state visit. Videos of the aftermath of the shooting showed bodies on the floor, close to a white pickup truck. Koulamallah said the attackers were unalive after managing to penetrate the camp surrounding the presidency. "I was impressed by the military deployment. We have a very good army and the Chadians can sleep soundly. Our country is well guarded," he said. According to the minister, at least 6 people have been arrested in connection with the attack, although it's unclear yet who they are and investigations are still ongoing. Following the attack and the response of the military, things have returned to normalcy in the city. Shops, schools, administration, and businesses opened their doors, following the assurance given by the government that the situation was under control, the day after the incidents in the Chadian capital. However, the citizens of Chad have strongly condemned the violence, calling for peace dialogue and the use of democratic means to take power. Today, we are in the digital age, and there are many other legal ways to make ourselves heard. This culture of violence does not reflect the generation we are. Fumes Mbiramaji Desire, president of the Association of Young Rainbows for Social Stability in Africa. The same tone is echoed by the Chadian Youth Parliament, which condemns the attack as a senseless act. "You have to be an unconscious young person to attack the symbol of our sovereignty. Our country has suffered too much from violence. It must stop," insists its president Jamus Bichara Bachir. Now here is the big question. Who was behind the attack? Since the attack happened on Wednesday, there have been several conflicting theories about who might have been responsible. For some reason, some people blame it on jihadist group, which is understandable given that they have launched several attacks in Chad since 2013. Although the group was originally founded in Nigeria, porous borders allowed it to expand operations. In 2015, jihadist group targeted police buildings and markets in N'Djamena in a series of attacks. More than 50 people were unalive, and more than 100 were injured. Those who believe that the attack was orchestrated by jihadist group believe that it might be a retaliation against Operation Haskanite. Operation Haskanite was a security operation launched by the President of Chad in October 2024. The aim is to track and neutralize hundreds of jihadist fighters who attacked and killed more than 40 Chadian troops in the Lake Chad Basin area on October 28th. However, authorities in Chad have shut down this theory as baseless. In an interview with Chad's state broadcaster hours after the attack, spokesman Koulamallah said the attackers were not jihadist group members or part of an organized armed group. He described them instead as drunken pieds nickels, a reference to a French comic featuring hapless crooks. But the fact is that a random pair of crooks would find it difficult to attack the seat of power in N'Djamena. This is why we believe the statement made by Takalal Ndolassum Hilaire, national advisor and the president of the Front for the Liberation of Chad Party, regarding the attack. According to him, the attack on January 8th was a result of France's resistance to Chad's independence. Takalal explained that France viewed Chad as a convenient free aircraft carrier and was unwilling to relinquish control. The politician further suggested that it was no accident that the French authorities exaggerated the significance of the attack, calling it a coup d'état. He argued that the West often amplifies events to demonstrate their importance and influence, creating the impression that problems are unsolvable without their intervention. He said, "Today, everyone knows that the financing of terrorism comes from the West, since there are military leaders who have been arrested. And during their interrogation, they all said that they were financed by the West." Now, if you recall, some days before the attack, President Macron made a ridiculous statement about Francophone countries, including Chad. The French president stated that he was still awaiting thanks from the Sahel states for Paris's efforts in preventing them from succumbing to militant control. Macron further added that France made the right decision to intervene in 2013 to combat Islamist militants, despite the fact that those countries have since distanced themselves from French military assistance. In his own words, "I think that they forgot to thank us, but that's okay, it will come in time." This right here is the words of a man who is pissed that some African countries would dare to humiliate France by kicking them out. But that's not all. He added that none of them would have a sovereign state if the French army had not deployed in this region. Following this statement, the authorities in Chad rebuked Macron's statement and emphasized the need for French leaders to respect African sacrifices. In the student published by the authorities in Chad, Macron was urged to leave African countries and focus on dealing with France's own problems. But that's not all. The Chadian government also reaffirmed that the deadline for the withdrawal of French troops remains January 31st, 2025. This means that the last stronghold of France's influence in the Sahel will be gone forever. Obviously, this is a development that France never imagined or expected to happen. You see, France probably expected to be kicked out of Burkina Faso, Niger, and Mali because the coup removed the French puppets in position and replaced them with tough military rulers who prioritized the sovereignty of their countries. Chad, however, is different. You see, Chad has been a long-time ally of France. The Chadian president's late father, Idriss Deby Itno, who ruled Chad for more than 30 years beginning from 1991, was a staunch ally of France. It was through France's support that he was able to maintain his hold on power for so long. Now, before his death in 2021, Idriss had already won an election which would have enabled him to rule for a sixth term. But his untimely death ended that ambition, and according to Chad's constitution, the Speaker of the Parliament should become the interim president upon the death of an incumbent. But that wasn't what happened. Instead, after presiding over the funeral of the late Idriss Deby, French President Emmanuel Macron quickly aided the Chad military to install Mahamar Deby, the son of Idriss Deby, as the interim president of Chad. This is not surprising because it was the only way for France to continue to maintain its relationship with Chad. The fact that it was undemocratic and unconstitutional didn't matter to France. Again, it's not surprising because France has had long-backed dictators in Chad in exchange for Chadian soldiers fighting alongside France in the region and for French bases in the country. That support has extended to French jets bombing rebel columns. A good example was in 2019, upon the request of Idriss Deby, the French government deployed 7 jet fighters that annihilated an armed convoy during 4 days of strikes. This, as we said, is the singular reason Idriss Deby was able to rule for so long. So, given that France has always backed Chad and Macron helped Mahamat to become president, the French president never expected that Chad would one day turn its back on France. This is why Chad's decision to end the defense pact with France is particularly painful for President Macron. So, his statement about awaiting thanks from the Sahel countries was from a place of pain and frustration. So isn't it suspicious that just a few days after Macron made that statement, the Chadian president was the target of an assassination attempt? In our opinion, it is definitely suspicious, and it would not be far-fetched to say that it was orchestrated by France. After all, France has orchestrated several assassination attempts in Africa. A good example was Thomas Sankara. As you know, Sankara was an exceptional leader who exemplified what a true leader should be. He was the opposite of today's African presidents who live lavishly in their big mansions, drive exotic cars, and enjoy the good things of life while the people they are leading live in poverty and penury. Sankara rode a bicycle to work as prime minister and later as president before upgrading to a Renault 5, one of the cheapest automobiles available in Burkina Faso at the time. At the demand of his cabinet, he lived in a small brick house and exclusively wore cotton that was grown, woven and sewed in Burkina Faso. His mindset was different from every other leader. When he came to power, Sankara reasoned that Burkina Faso was the way it was because of the political leaders, so he decided to change the status quo of things. He put an end to politicians living extravagant lives funded by taxpayers' money and cut down the salaries of every politician, including himself. The Mercedes-Benz fleet for high-ranking officials was phased out, and the cars were replaced by Renault 5s. The wealth from land and oil was nationalized. His reign brought about a change in the health, education, and the environmental sector of Burkina Faso. Mass vaccination efforts were launched with a speed and success that was unusual for an African country at the time. Infant mortality rates fell, school attendance rates doubled, and millions of trees were planted as part of a long-term effort to combat deforestation. Feminism was also a fundamental component of political philosophy, manifesting itself in increased access to education for girls and the involvement of women in positions of leadership. Sankara even went further to institute a day of solidarity in which men swapped typical gender responsibilities, such as going to the market and running the family, in order to better understand what women face on a daily basis. It was the biggest success story in African history until it was interrupted in blood in 1987. Sankara was 37 when he was gunned down on October 15, 1987, along with 12 other men. His life was cut short by a gunshot, which, according to witnesses, was ordered by former Liberian President Charles Taylor with the cooperation of the French and American governments, and delivered by Blaise Compaoré, Sankara's longtime friend and colleague. Sankara remains one of the continent's admired leaders, and his vision of Pan-African flourishing and an end to colonialism have long remained his legacy. Another African leader who was murdered with the support of France was Sylvanus Olympio. Togo's journey to independence can never be spoken of without talking about Sylvanus Olympio, the man who helped the country reach independence from France and paid the price for it. To frustrate Olympio's and the Togolese population's desire for independence and self-government, France demanded a payment of 800 million francs from the tiny West African colony with meager earnings to cover the cost of the so-called benefit of France colonization. Understanding that France was trying to keep their hold on the country, Olympio immediately set to work for 2 years, putting Togo's land and human resources to use in order to compensate France. Yet after paying France this colossal amount and gaining nominal independence, General Charles de Gaulle refused to relinquish control because he considered that all French colonies, independent or not, were France's property. To break his country free from French hold, Olympio decided to abandon the CFA franc currency, which had been imposed on France's colonies at gunpoint in 1945. This decision, however, did not go well with Paris, and so France decided to act. According to the African Lisbon tour, 2 days before Olympio was scheduled to sign the withdrawal agreement of Togo from the CFA francs currency at the Bank of France, France, with the assistance of the US, orchestrated his assassination. He was assassinated in a military coup in the US Embassy compound in Lomé in 1963 by Ayadema, one of Africa's worst dictators backed by the West. We can only wonder what Togo would have been under someone with such love, brilliance, and vision for his country. But what about Felix Mumi from Cameroon? On November 3, 1960, Felix Mumi, the famous independence fighter of Cameroon, also called Cameroon's Lumumba, died in Geneva following an official independence from France earlier that year. Felix Mumi was the leader of the political movement Union of the Cameroon People, UPC, a major political force demanding the end of UN trusteeship over Cameroon and full independence of the country. Sadly, he was poisoned by thallium by an agent of the French Secret Service. The Swiss authorities knew who assassinated Mumi, but under pressure from Paris, never indicted him and dismissed proceedings, and no one has been charged since. Cameroon was strategically important to the French government. Paris feared that if they were defeated by Mumi's UPC, a left-wing independence movement, France would lose not only Cameroon, but also other possessions in Western and Central Africa. And so, Felix Mumi had to disappear, and his movement had to be eliminated at any price. Following a mission to Geneva in October 1960, Felix was invited to dinner on the eve of his return to Conakry by 66-year-old William Bechtel, who claimed to be a journalist. Unfortunately, It was at that dinner that Felix was poisoned with thallium by William, who was a member of the French assassination unit called Le Main Rouge. So, if France could have all these people assassinated, it certainly could have the Chad president assassinated as well. What do you think? Let us know in the comments section below. Don't forget to like this video, drop a comment, and share.